Hello, friends of the IDF from freezing New Jersey. Right now, IDF forces are working nonstop, preparing defenses for the possibility of an Iranian escalation. They're reinforcing air and missile defenses, integrating new aircraft capabilities that have recently arrived in the last week. They're training for multiple scenarios while remaining active on many fronts. These are the young men and women who are carrying the weight of deterrence while the whole world is focused on so many issues. And that's why we are so grateful to be joined by Jonathan Schanzer, our longtime friend and trusted voice of this community. Jonathan is the executive director of the Foundation for the Defense Democracies, where he works so closely with U.S. policymakers, military leaders, and international partners on the most urgent security challenges facing Israel and the democratic world. He understands the strategic chessboard and what that means for the soldiers who are standing watch right now. So, Jonathan, thank you for being with us. It's always a privilege. And before I dive into the many, many questions, I would love to just hand you the floor. And if you can tell us, what is going on as our soldiers are right now preparing for the possibility of an Iranian attack?
Well, first of all, thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure to work with you and this wonderful community that you've cultivated. Look, these are historic moments in the Middle East, and I am fully aware of the fact that we have been saying that now for 2.5 years. But really what I'm watching right now gives us a sense that whatever we've been watching and how historic it's been for the last 2.5 years, we may be reaching a culmination, a peak, a zenith, if you will, of this conflict that has been raging in the Middle East. It was, of course, sparked by the Islamic Republic of Iran and its proxies. Hamas is, of course, a proxy of Iran. So is Hezbollah. So are the Houthis. And so what we're watching right now is a showdown between Donald Trump in particular and the Islamic Republic. Now, of course, all this tracks back to December 28th when the protest movement erupted. That protest movement was not hard to predict. Of course, we've seen multiple protests over time by the Iranian people protesting the oppressive regime in Tehran. But I would say that over 2009, 2018, 2022, we didn't see the sort of confluence of events that we're watching right now. Namely, here I'm speaking about not just the mismanagement of the country, not just the oppression of the regime, but the defeat of the Islamic Republic during that 12-day war at the hands of Israel. Israel dominated the skies over Iran. And then, of course, Donald Trump dropped the midnight hammer on the regime, taking out those 3 nuclear facilities. Since then, we've heard about sanctions biting harder. So the economic situation has gotten worse. The rial, the currency, is just plummeting. 1.3, 1.4 million rials to the dollar right now. Zero purchasing power. Iranians are clearly upset about what's happening there. Water shortages that are prompting or were prompting the regime to consider moving the capital from Tehran to someplace else. I don't even know how that works. And then, electricity problems, broader mismanagement. You get a sense of what's happening here. It is an enormous challenge for the regime. They are struggling to keep a handle on things, and now people are coming out into the streets. The numbers continue to grow. Of course, we know the regime has cracked down on communication. They have crushed it. There is really very little ability for the people of Iran to upload those images. We've seen some of them, and they're all very jarring. But we're only seeing a fraction of what has come out of the Islamic Republic. Initially, we were hearing 2,000 dead. Then we were hearing 4,000 dead. Then we were hearing 20,000 dead. Right now, according to some reports, and of course, all of this is still very fuzzy, but numbers suggest that it could be as high as 30,000 people killed by the regime. And now we have the Mossad sharing information with the United States that there are mass executions that are being carried out. That's important because last week on Wednesday, Donald Trump had actually sent aircraft to Iran with the intent of bombing them. They were 17 minutes away, according to the reports that we've heard, of dropping ordnance on certain targets throughout Iran and beginning to strike the regime and its centers of power. The president turned around. We're not sure exactly what happened. We were hearing that Israel may have found something that made them nervous. The Gulf states may have been nervous about their defense posture. The president himself may have been nervous about the lack of a cohesive plan and perhaps saw the need to wait. But what he said is that he's given the regime time to walk back this mass execution. He basically said that if they didn't slaughter those protesters that had been arrested, then perhaps the United States might not strike. The new intelligence that has come out over the last 24 hours provided by the Mossad seems to fly in the face of whatever Donald Trump thought might happen. And when we look at what's happening across the region right now, it is remarkable. The United States has a massive armada in the CENTCOM AOR, the area of responsibility of CENTCOM. This is the Middle East Directorate of the Pentagon. So in other words, we have a huge amount of firepower that has been moved into the region. We have defense posture that we can see, not just in Israel, and there have been a lot of drills, and the IDF has done a lot of tests to make sure that their defense posture is properly prepared. But we're also watching the U.S. engage pretty robustly right now with Arab states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, for fear that there could be a strike by Iran in some of these countries as they try to respond. But make no mistake, it feels right now, I'm not saying that 100% it's happening, but it feels like we're on the precipice of a large war. Unlike anything that we have seen, this is not just regime change. This is crushing every possible aspect of regime power, sort of like what we saw during the Second Gulf War when the United States took out all of Ba'athist Iraqi assets, Saddam Hussein's assets. But it feels a little different now because the Islamic Republic has all of these proxies, and it really does look like a wounded animal right now, backed up into a corner, and we're just not sure what it's capable of doing. So there is a lot of concern in Israel about the need to go to shelter, the need to have more Arrow 3 defense interceptors. The U.S. appears to be putting more air defense interceptors throughout the region with the idea of protecting the Israelis. We've heard, by the way, that the Brits are also there, potentially to shoot down drones or other projectiles fired by the Islamic Republic at Israel and other countries. The missile arsenal is, I think, important to note here. The Islamic Republic had something like 2,500 missiles heading into the June war of last year. Right now, we're hearing 4 or 6 or even 7,000 missiles, so they pose a real threat. All of this is just to say we are on high alert. We're watching. No one knows exactly when this might happen. It's all coming down to Donald Trump. Now, a couple of other quick things just to note. There was a lot of news this week about the so-called Board of Peace that Donald Trump stood up. This is the product of the 20-point plan that he came up with last year in the fall. It was enshrined in international law on November 24th at the UN. So in other words, this is just a natural consequence of what comes out of it. What I'm watching right now, and I think this is, I think an important thing for all to understand, is this thing is designed, I think, in part because it didn't mention Gaza in its charter, right? They're thinking, I think, much bigger right now about what the region might look like, who might help take control of the region, help rebuild the region after this war that could be coming. And I think that's important to note. There are a lot of people who have been talking about how Vladimir Putin was on that board and he maybe shouldn't have been. Let me just say, you're going to probably need some kind of Russian buy-in for whatever happens next if the Islamic Republic falls, if the Arab world finds itself in the position where it needs to kind of rebuild and restructure. What I'm most concerned about right now, though, and maybe I'll leave it here and you can ask me whatever is on your mind, but I'm concerned about the Qataris and the Turks on that board. They're not global powers. They're not even, maybe you could call the Turks a regional power. They should not be on that board because they were the sponsors of Hamas headquarters in both countries, right? Financing for Hamas in both countries. They have actually been rolling out the red carpet for Hamas leadership over the last 2.5 years. They have been undeniably part of the problem, not part of the solution. I'm concerned about that, but I'm also concerned about the influence that these two countries might have They already have an enormous amount of influence in Syria, where we know that tensions have been intermittently high and less high between Israel and the new regime there, as we've watched the new regime slaughter minorities, attack Kurds, attack Druze, and the Israelis have been very concerned about Turkish assets on the ground inside of Syria. We're concerned about Turkish and Qatari involvement in Lebanon. In other words, what we need to watch for right now, if you ask me, is not just does the regime go down in Iran and how long does that take and how much instability does it bring to the region. And there is a lot of risk right now that comes from intervention. There's a lot of reward if done right, but there's a lot of risk, right? You could watch things drag out for a very long period of time, or it could be done cleanly. Nobody knows, right? But then there's the question of if the regime is finally toppled and there is this vacuum, this ability to recreate a regional order. Israel obviously is a very strong regional power, but it doesn't have power projection. We always call them the Israel Defense Forces, right? They defend Israel. They're not out there projecting power all around the region. They don't have outposts all over the Middle East and beyond. They may be starting to think about that in places like the Horn of Africa. But this is not the way the IDF typically operates. The Turks, far more aggressive. They're already thinking about power projection. They have the second largest army in NATO. They have the ability, should they choose, should they wish, with Qatari finance. These two countries are a partnership. They have a vision for spreading the Muslim Brotherhood. So what we're watching right now, when we think about kind of the worst case, is we have a replacement of the Muslim Brotherhood for the Islamic Republic, this sort of Shiite radical, power that has been ravaging the Middle East, right, for the last almost 50 plus years. These are the things that you don't want to see. The things that you do want to see are the United States reestablishing its dominance in the world, showing the region that you cannot continue to behave like Iran has, stoking unrest and violence and mayhem around the region for the last 2.5 years, let alone the last 5 decades. This is a reestablishment of the American-led world order. We're all worried, though, that Donald Trump sees Turkey and Qatar, who are now on this board of peace, as partners. And so this is, I think, the great challenge for the Israelis as they look at the horizon, as they look at what may come next. But for now, I think all eyes are on the Persian Gulf, that massive armada that the United States has put all around the Islamic Republic of Iran. It does look like their days are numbered. Maybe this turns into some sort of diplomatic moment where the regime understands that it will be destroyed, so it starts to talk with the United States. There's real danger in that, but maybe opportunity if it means bringing about an end to the mayhem. I'll leave it there, but suffice it to say, a really wild moment in the Middle East. You're muted, Lara. Can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I definitely want to come back to the Board of Peace in a moment, but before we get there, let's talk a little bit more about Iran. So what I'm hearing you say is that you do feel like action is going to happen here. I guess the reason that I want to just come back to this is because some people are fearing, on the one hand, that the moment has passed because, there's already been this enormous massacre and there was the promise that if you slaughter the civilians, that the U.S. will intervene. And yet, the U.S. did, turn around, as you just said. And there were these rumors that Israel was actually saying, hang on, pump the brakes. And we've had generals, on this program who've said that actually what's best for Israel is for this to be small, is for this to be maybe, under wraps, because until the Revolutionary Guard and until the regular army gets on board with the revolution, it won't happen. So can you speak to some of these things and how that, if there will still be the attack, because meanwhile, all of Israel is hunkering down and is in this perpetual state of fear that we haven't even seen the worst yet after those historic ballistic missile attacks just last summer.
Yeah. And look, to be clear, there is very little that is more harrowing than knowing that you've got missiles the size of a bus coming at your country and that you need to hunker down. I was actually in Israel for the first half of that war with a group that we brought from FDD. It was not not easy times. And I feel very much for the people of Israel as they consider whether this is something that may have to happen again. Look, as far as the window closing, I don't think it's closed. And the reason why is, I mean, look, the protest movement has petered out. I think that, appears to be clear. But that's maybe not why this is all happening, right? I mean, I think the president seems to understand that the regime is the problem. He's currying favor with a lot of the other actors in the region. He wants to rebuild Gaza. He wants to get past this moment of conflict. And he thinks that this may be, at least as we understand it, this may be the answer. Yes, he turned those planes around last week on Wednesday. Yes, that was a big, reversal, an expensive one at that. But the expense of keeping this huge armada in the region, and by the way, making a decision not to have them in Asia or in Latin America, where we have other vested interests, to me speaks volumes. Why amass such an enormous force if you're not going to use it? Now, using it could be a couple of different things. A modest attack, surgical strikes on certain things, maybe try to take out the supreme leader and the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, and the Basij, the internal repression forces, and maybe the military platforms that are suppressing Iranians' ability to post things online. These are some of the specific things that you might see, and maybe you leave it there, or you could see something much bigger, much more expansive, and maybe much more final as it relates to the future of the Islamic Republic. And then, there's the question again of whether the diplomatic approach prevails. In other words, you use all of this to prevail upon the Islamic Republic to come to the table, and not for this sort of, ridiculous, nuclear, dance that we've been doing with the regime for the last 15, 20 years, but actually to say, look, this is the end of the regime as we know it, right? You're not doing any of this stuff anymore. Hezbollah, done. Hamas, done. Houthis, done. It's all getting wrapped up, and you're going to become a normal country. It's at the point of a gun, right? Where you're saying, make these changes or else. These are all things that I think are very possible. And look, it all comes down to one man. And people have been saying, oh, it's the fog of war. I've been saying, no, it's the fog of Trump, right? This man, we don't know how to predict his next moves. I don't know if he knows how to predict his next moves. He has done enormously positive things across the Middle East. I'm still concerned, and again, I'll just say it here, I'm concerned about some of the friends that he's made that could be alternatives to the Islamic Republic as we watch regional powers, kind of eye the changes in the region and how that might benefit them. But up until now, he has done very positive things for the region. He's weakened the regime. He has strengthened Israel. I think all of these things are good. Now the question is this the big moment? And does he have all of the different pieces in place to defend Israel, to defend other Arab countries, to carry out first strikes that would potentially really eviscerate the regime and deprive the regime of its capability of carrying out large-scale attacks? These are all the things that we're watching. And then, of course, there's the diplomatic side of this too. So again, lots of different roads we could go down here, but it does not feel like a small moment. It feels like one of the bigger moments that we have seen in the Middle East in a long time, in 20 plus years.
Right. We've surely learned, especially after that moment of strategic deception, during Rising Line, where it looked like there was daylight between Israel and America, and then turn around and here comes America, to the aid. And so we really never know what's going on here. And perhaps that's intentional, and perhaps that's part of it. So we're all in the wait and see. If this was to escalate, one of the things that was interesting, if we're going to try and learn from history, was that during Rising Lion, Hezbollah didn't enter the war. In this scenario, do you predict that Hezbollah would enter the war, and that, the proxies would come together in a way that they didn't before? Or do you feel like the proxies are too damaged to really be able to do that? And it does, also bring us back to Hamas, or whatever remnant of it is left. And from there, I'd love for you to touch on what's happening in Gaza,
Sure.
and how you see this next phase, and what it means for, the sort of seemingly moving on when we do still have Ron Gvili, that we're waiting for, and just how you see the proxies in this paradigm.
Sure. No, it's a great question. And obviously, we need to keep an eye on these files. They all felt like really big files before, and now they almost feel like they're, secondary importance, which is, again, I think why this is you can feel how big this moment really, the enormity of this moment. It's very clear, I think to all when we start looking at all these proxies that Israel has been at war with, and they feel like almost sideshows. Look, the way that I would look at it is this. The Houthis have missiles that they can fire, and they've shown a willingness to do so. There are large numbers of missiles and fighters in Iraq that were quiet during Rising Lion that we did not see. They were the dog that didn't bark. We saw some attacks by Iraqi militias earlier on in the war, and then that ended up halting. Basically, I think as part of an agreement where the United States was directly threatening the government of Iraq and maybe Iran itself. The Hezbollah, they still have, let's say, 20 to 30% of their arsenal, long-distance missiles. They have the ability. So when I look collectively at those missile stores and those capabilities, I am concerned that we could have a saturation attack on Israel. And Israel would need to deploy Arrow 3 for the long-distance stuff out of Iran and out of Yemen. But then you've got, the David Sling mid-level stuff that would need to intercept all of the interceptors or all the missiles coming out of Iraq and maybe even northern Lebanon, and Iron Dome for any of the short-range stuff. Most of the short-range stuff is gone. So it's mid and long range is what we're concerned about. The Israeli air defenses have been pretty remarkable throughout this war, but they've never really had to contend with a saturation bombing attack. That's actually what I was fearful of in the first days of the war. When the war broke out on October 7th of 2023, my fear was that Hezbollah was going to start saturating Israel, that the Houthis would do it, that the Shia militias in Iraq, in Syria before Syria fell, that there was this potential for the Ring of Fire, the entire Ring of Fire, to be animated and activated, and that Israel would find itself incurring enormous damage. And when I talked to Israeli officials about this was one of their fears, and it never came to fruition. And so the question I think that you're asking is, did they learn their lesson from last time? Do they want to do this again? And I don't know the answer to that. I think they have to understand, all the proxies, that Iran is weaker, the regime in Iran is weaker than it's ever been. And that if the regime falls, then they're falling, that it all collapses. So on the one hand, maybe don't go there and surrender and live to fight another day, or maybe just start to join the countries that you've been undermining. On the other hand, if you feel like this is your do or die moment, use it or lose it, that could be what goes on here too. Hard to know what's happening here. And people will say, well, we'll just look at the rhetoric. When I look at Naim Qassem, the head of Hezbollah, and the kind of bravado that's coming out from Hezbollah right now, I don't know whether to take that at face value. I think that's really hard to know. Now, the last question that I think is an interesting one is Gaza itself. I don't see Gaza as a threat in this coming conflict, if there is one. I mean, it is a spent force. We've seen the number of rockets fired out of Gaza. I mean, first, they only control 47% of Gaza. So the space is closing in on them. You can see literally the walls are closing in on Hamas. The thing that I think is really even more interesting to look at right now is the calculus behind the decision to move to phase 2 of Trump's 20-point plan. Again, enshrined in international law now, which I think is also interesting. It gives the United States and all of the Board of Peace, it gives a mandate, right? And I think that mandate is important here to understand. They've decided to move forward. Why? Not because they've given up on getting Ron Gvili back, because I think obviously this is hugely important for Trump. Trump has made it, a mission of his to get all of the hostages back, and he said so. And I think Stephen Witkoff has done a great job of following through on that. Obviously Jared Kushner as well has taken an active interest. But I think what the underlying message right now is we're not giving Hamas a veto on the idea of moving forward to reconstructing and re-envisioning the Gaza Strip. If you saw the proposal from Jared Kushner, now I got to say, people have made fun of it, people have belittled it, and I get why. But what they're thinking right now is a complete rebuilding of the Gaza Strip, right? They were showing models of skyscrapers and, a full reimagining of the Gaza Strip. They want to move forward with this, and they're not letting Hamas say no. In other words, if holding back one hostage stopped them from the next process or the next phase of this process of fully dismantling Hamas, and you've heard the president say, if they don't disarm, then they're going to get shellacked. They're going to get completely bombed and dismantled. So
well, they've gotten
I
flack
see
that Hamas is there at all. That Hamas
right.
is even still part of the conversation.
Right. So I think right now what we're looking at here is, a collective understanding that Hamas should not be there, cannot continue to remain there. Now, again, I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record here today, but when you talk about the fact that Qatar and Turkey are on this board of peace, they're involved in the implementation of phase 2. They are patrons and sponsors and ideological drivers of Hamas. What role are they playing? Have we let the fox into the hen house, or have we co-opted them to be partners in the dismantling of the terror proxy that they were wielding? This is what has been bothering me about this entire process, really from day one, right? We brought in the Qataris to help negotiate the hostage release, and it didn't happen, right? It happened in little phases here and there, but it took the Israeli Air Force to bomb Qatar to convince the Qataris that they needed to get all of those hostages out so that they didn't become the eighth front in the war. The Turks, absolutely on a warpath, and you can see it. They are aggressive. Their anti-Israel rhetoric is at an all-time high. Their willingness to try to put boots on the ground in Gaza to potentially prop up their proxy, very worrying. We're hearing that they're giving funds and weapons to Hezbollah. This is an Iranian proxy, a Shiite proxy. Turkey is a Sunni country that never had anything to do with Hezbollah. They are trying to co-opt Hezbollah right now. They have co-opted the regime in Syria. So look at what's happening. The Iranian regime is weakening its ring of fire around Israel. And the Turks are trying to grab whatever they can. And so this is when I talk about the future of Gaza, the future of the region, the future of this sort of board of peace. These are the two countries that worry me most. I don't know, again, I don't love Vladimir Putin being on this, but I don't see him as an arch enemy of Israel. I don't see him as a guy that's necessarily dedicated to disrupting regional stability. I think he could probably figure out a pragmatic way to benefit from all of this. That is the Putin way. It's those two countries that worry me the most right now as we talk about moving on to phase 2 and destroying Hamas.
So I have to ask, because it is concerning. And I remember when the U.S. did the deal with Qatar, the huge military deal, and then the enabling of a Qatari base within America. And we were all sort of, just gobsmacked, like, what is that? What could that mean? And trying to figure out what is the alternative. If it's not letting the fox into the hen house, then what is it? Is it keeping your enemies close? But that they're funding all of the unrest within the United States, all of the brainwashing in the universities. Like, what is the other side to it? If it's not the fox into the hen house, like, what could the positive side possibly be, just if we're looking to understand both sides of it? Because from where I sit, it's really hard to see it as anything else.
Look, your concern is my concern, and it's why I've been the broken record that I have been during this discussion. I am very worried about the presence of Qatar and the presence of Turkey. On the Qatari file, let me just say, we at FDD, we've done a lot of work on this, and we'll be releasing things soon about Qatari influence, not just in higher ed, which I think is fairly well known, but also in K through 12. The massive amount, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of investment here in the United States. That looks like an attempt to co-opt, American power brokers, American stakeholders. None of this should be happening. I will say, though, that at the end of the day, the Qataris, and people forget this, You could say that the Turks are the second largest army in NATO, and they're a regional power, and they have some muscle to flex. I don't want to discount that because they do. The Qataris, not so much. They are enormously wealthy. They control 12% of the world's energy, but they are a country that is smaller than the state of Delaware. They have 330,000 citizens, right? This is like a neighborhood in New York, right? When we talk about their, the personnel, when we talk about the population. They don't have an army. Our Air Force that is based at the Al Udeid CAOC, as it's called, the Combined Air Operations Center that's based there. It's our largest air base in the Middle East. The Qataris paid for it, right? It was something like $8 billion to our specifications. And that's all wonderful for us, right? We get a free base out of it. But we essentially already occupy Qatar, right? If they don't have an army and we do, we still have a lot of leverage. Now, the question is, in my mind, when does Donald Trump want to use that leverage and to get them to stop some of this stuff, right? Now, we don't need to declare Qatar to be an enemy state, although I do think that it acts like one. What we need to do is we need to make it clear what is permissible and what is not. No more sponsoring Hamas. No more sponsoring the Taliban. No more sponsoring Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the Muslim Brotherhood, right? No more investments in the United States that influence our young people or that buy off our politicians. These are the sorts of rules that I think we can establish with a weak and wealthy country. We've given them, in my view, too much influence. We've given them too much leash. It's time to pull back the leash. It's time to choke a little bit here, to continue the metaphor. We need to make sure that they understand what they can and cannot do. I don't think we've done that yet. This does feel like a moment, though, if the region is about to go through some of the changes that we think could be on the horizon, it's going to be really important for Donald Trump to draw some lines and to create some new rules with some of these regional players. It looks like he's trying to co-opt them, but co-opting means our rules, not theirs. And that's what I think is important to remember here for the president. Let's hope he's listening.
Absolutely. All right. For my final question, I just want to ask, we really feel like the pressure of the moment because this is an administration that could restore deterrence. Do you feel like Qatar, Turkey, and Iran are still, that deterrence can still work for any of them? Or do you feel that, and really the alliance with Israel, and, we heard how, Britain is also sending some forces into the area. Do you feel that deterrence could still have an effect here? Or do you really feel like it's just a matter of time? And that perhaps, war is the best option in this case because, this is a regime and this is a group that only responds to strength.
Yeah, I mean, look, with Iran, look, I'd love it if they just said, okay, you're right. We've been really bad for 5 decades and we've just decided we're going to change and we're now going to be a democracy and we're going to stop sponsoring terrorists.
And kumbaya, right.
Right.
Of course.
I mean, that feels like a pretty rosy take on what could happen here. So if you ask me about that, it feels like, deterrence is not the thing. I think, strength through superior firepower, look, getting them to stand down and getting them to agree under duress is different than deterrence, right? It's making them make choices at the point of a gun. That is still possible, although I think the regime would not be the regime if it didn't try to fight and win, right? So, when you talk about a regime where its pillars are death to America, death to Israel, right? I mean, if that's what they stand for, then the idea of them standing down in the face of, an American armada amassing on their doorstep, I'm not sure. I got to say, that's why this feels like such an important and big moment in the region. We've put all these forces there. I would be surprised if we didn't use them. But again, the fog of Trump. As for the rest of the region, the Qataris, the Turks, but also, let's put in there the Emiratis, the Saudis, who have yet to normalize with Israel. I look at what happened after the first Gulf War, where America was undeniably, number one, we had just won the Cold War, which we're not doing with China, but fine. But then on top of that, we went in and we just just demolished Saddam Hussein's regime. We didn't take him out, which probably was a mistake, but the regime itself was reeling as a result. The region looked on at George H.W. Bush and then ultimately Bill Clinton as the power broker for the region. And we were able to call the shots. Now, I'm not telling you that the Oslo process was the best thing since sliced bread, right? I'm sure we all have different opinions about the two-state solution and the mistakes that were made along the way. But the United States was able to impose its will and to demand that the international community get behind this process of two states. We have the ability to get behind a different process here right now. Whatever that process is, whatever Donald Trump has decided that he wants to essentially envision for the region, my guess is that it's more prosperity, more economic opportunity, more normalization. I don't know if we're going to try to push all the way for Palestinian-Israeli peace. That might be a little bit too big. But this is the moment, right? If we're able to demonstrate significant strength around the region, history shows that we can wield it for us, right? For the United States, and hopefully to the benefit of Israel as well. I know that, of course, Bibi and Trump have a very positive relationship. I've got to imagine that they're in close touch. I've got to imagine that they have a shared vision for what comes next in the region. I've already enumerated some of the challenges that I think are lingering out there. And again, let me just say, this could go, if the United States moves, this could go clean, it could go messy, it could go somewhere in the middle, it could be short, it could be long. We don't know, right? This is unintended consequences. We've reached that moment right now of, an action, a significant action in the region could spark a chain of events, and we don't know where that leads us, but certainly we get a sense that those events may start to transpire soon.
Wow. Jonathan, thank you, not just for your insight, but for the clarity and really the steadiness that you bring with so many moving parts. Everyone, as we've discussed, while the strategies are debated and the alliances recalibrated, Israel soldiers are working nonstop. They are preparing their defenses, they're training for whatever will come next, and they are the ones who are standing between the regime and Israel's civilians. So for our FIDF community, the answer to what can I do is super clear right now. Stand with the soldiers who are standing for all of us. Stay informed, speak up for them, ensure that they have the care, the support, and the resources they need to carry this burden. We are so grateful for your partnership, for your friendship, your being BFFs with our soldiers, and your unwavering commitment to Israel's security and its defenders. Thank you again, Dr. Schanzer, for being with us. Always, always a pleasure and so insightful. Everyone stay warm if you're in the Northeast, and have a good day.